Hello and welcome to NAS Compares. Chances are if you found this video it's because you are looking to set up your brand new Synology NAS and you want to do it right the first time. The reason being, if you make a mistake, the last thing you want to do is roll back. Now, we've been covering the subject of NAS and Synology for many years at this point, and indeed we have been releasing guides and setup guides for all of the popular brands for quite a few years, but we've not done one for Synology for about 2 years, and a lot has changed. They've changed a lot of the user interface. There's been major updates to a lot of the default admin settings on a lot of these devices, changes to a lot of the shared folder configurations, and ultimately we thought it pertinent to revisit the subject of setting one of these up for the first time for a complete novice. So in this video, this is the first part of a series of videos, and in this whole series, it's going to be about 8 or 9 parts long. We are going to cover everything, but we are doing it to someone, yourself, who is completely new to this. This is a true new noob's novice guide. We're going to be going through everything in detail, and while we're going through it, it's going to be slow sometimes. If you know what you're doing, again, time bar on the bottom, there's chapters, and there's the option to speed up what I'm saying very quickly to 2.5 times speed if you really want to. But let's crack on. So first and foremost, what are you going to need to set up your Synology for the first time? Well, you're going to need a Synology to start with. This is the DS1522 Plus. This guide and all of the steps in this video can work for pretty much any Synology from rack mount to desktop, but I'm using this one because it has a lot of feature set for us to sort of explore throughout this series, and it's probably one of the best ones. But on top of that, you need more than this. What else are you going to need? Well, you're going to need the Synology accessory kit that all your devices arrive with. Inside, you'll find your PSU. Some devices will have, the larger NAS devices will have the power supply built in. So in those devices, it'll just go directly into the back. But the majority of desktop devices arrive with the power supplier as an external power brick there, with your mains connected there on the rear. Another thing you're going to need is your Ethernet cable. You're going to need at least one of these. Again, you should have that included with your Synology kit, but it's an RJ45, Cat5, Cat E. If you look those up, you'll find those in any retailer. On top of that, you're going to need your storage media. Now, although I'm going to talk about a lot of brands in the course of the next few weeks in these series of videos, I will state right now that Synology does bring a very unique advantage to the table that the majority of brands don't. Now, you can see 4 drives here, but we're only going to be installing 2 of them. We're going to be using these drives, the Synology's own 4TB HAT 3300 Plus series drives. We're going to be installing those inside this system. The reason I've got the other drives is later in this series, I'm going to be showing you one of the great advantages of a Synology is Synology Hybrid RAID, SHR, and that allows you to install different drives and then imbue and absorb all of the extra storage they provide in a way that traditional RAID configurations, known as RAID or redundant array of independent disks, allows you to have multiple drives and a safety net. That's what RAID is. It allows you to have multiple drives with the data spread across them, and if one of the drives dies, your data is still safe. It's not a backup, hence the top, but it does give you a safety net. And later on in this series, I'll be showing you how to install extra drives later on and take advantage and leverage all of that extra storage. But I will highlight as well that the reason I'm only installing 2 drives in this larger system here is when you are setting up your Synology NAS for the first time, one of the things you can do to kind of plan for the future and also leverage how much money you're going to be spending is you don't have to fully populate these devices. You can get away with installing as little as 1 drive if you choose. And the Synology software DSM or Disk Station Manager will allow you to add drives granularly as the years go on, and as you add those drives, it rolls it into the original storage known as the storage pool, and therefore have more space later and expand. It allows you, rather than trying to fully spec this out on day one, you can go ahead and get just 2 drives and then have them in, say, a RAID 1 or SHR, and then have 1 drive of that failure protection we just mentioned about, that redundancy, that safety net. So I'm only putting 2 drives in because later in this series I'm going to be showing you how to add drives later, something you may be doing years down the line. Another thing we're going to be talking about is NVMe SSDs. A lot of Synology devices arrive at their base with the option, or sometimes internally, of adding M.2 NVMes. and the extent to which you can use these SSDs will differ depending on the one you go for. I'm going to be installing inside this system one Synology SSD, an SNV 3400, and one third-party drive from Titanium Micro. Now, why are we using two different drives? Well, that will be a lot clearer later on in the series, but in brief, Synology SSDs can be used as caching, or they can be used as storage pools, faster areas of storage, whereas third-party drives can only be used for caching. And later on through the series, I'll be showing you a little bit more about that there. But if you are looking at buying your first Synology and the salesman who you were buying it from was trying to upsell sticking in SSDs, there's every possibility you don't even need them. So later on we'll discuss that, but don't immediately go out and buy these on day one. You do not need to. You can buy them later, and I'll show you how to integrate them and also find out if you actually need them. You may need a screwdriver, but one of the only reasons you're going to need a screwdriver is if you go for 2.5-inch SSD media. We're not going to be using these in today's video, but rather than hard drives, you can, if you choose, go ahead and go for 2.5-inch SSD media, and that allows you to get that faster kind of response from your storage. But just bear in mind that SSDs, they have a lower capacity rate rather than hard drives. Generally, these drives will go as high as maybe 4 TB or 8 TB if you want to go for lesser quality NAND, whereas hard drives can go up to currently 24 or even 26 terabytes in capacity there. So I'm not going to be using them. I just wanted to highlight them, and also that when you do install drives inside your system, SSDs need screws to go in these holes you can see here on screen, whereas hard drives go straight in the bays. So those are our accessories that we're going to use for this. So why don't we begin the installation? When installing the media inside your Synology NAS system, if you intend to install both hard drives and SSDs, always install the SSDs first. The reason being that during this installation, you're going to be moving this box around all over the place. And the last thing you want to do is shake up hard drives, as these are susceptible to motion damage, shock damage, and just generally are more fragile than SSDs. Now, for installing 2.5-inch SSDs, again, it will differ depending on the system you choose to use, but go ahead and access those M.2 NVMe panels on the base of your system. Again, with these SSDs, they go inside these slots, and Synology drives allow you to use both caching and storage, whereas third-party drives, it's only caching. Make sure that you do the alignment of the little key there at the top to meet the alignment of the slot it's going into. Once you install that inside, it should click into place, and there's a little clip there at the top of the system there, and then it will allow you to put that drive in and it will click into place. Again, you may see channels out there talking about the utilization of heat sinks, and again, I talked about it here on the channel. Heat sinks for SSDs do serve a purpose. These do not have moving parts, but they do get warm, and sometimes to draw that heat away from the SSD and dissipate it into the air, heat sinks can be used for that very purpose. However, the majority of Synology NAS systems at this scale do not utilize more than ×1 speed on the SSD inside. What does that mean? What that means is that the SSD that you may be installing may have a reported speed of 2, 3, 1,000 megabytes per second, but because the SSD slots are reduced to ×1 or ×2 speed on the Synology, often the result of more affordable CPUs being used, or intentionally by the brand to downgrade that speed to stop the drives getting hot, a lot of the time you're not going to need heat sinks for those slots. Once you've got your SSDs installed, go ahead and reapply those clips to cover up your SSDs. We flip the system over and we make our way onto the main storage bays here. So again, it's always recommended to work from slot 1, which in most cases is found on the left going to the right. Go ahead and grab your trays, and for a Synology NAS installation, it's really straightforward. You remove these side clips here, you take the drive in question, make sure the SATA connector is facing outwards and the label at the top, and apply it into your tray. It should sit neatly, and then your tray clip will go straight on you apply your other tray clip, and there you go. Your drive is now held in that tray there, and you simply need to slot it into the available slot on your Synology NAS. We'll repeat that process again with the second tray. Another thing you may have noticed on this system is each of those trays has a small locking mechanism there at the bottom. Now, realistically, that locking mechanism is not going to stop anyone that wants to take these drives out. It is not a comprehensive lock. It wouldn't match any kind of high-end security settings there. What that lock is traditionally used for is to ensure that users cannot accidentally remove drives, because sometimes you want to make sure these trays are locked. There'll be keys with your Synology setup there, but that stops someone accidentally removing that drive, accidentally or intentionally for that matter. Because if you do that, if that drive is removed, not only will that trigger a degraded RAID state, which is when, much as we saw earlier, a drive dies and it looks like the rest of the system is going to panic, but worse still, if a drive is removed from a system, even though the drive is healthy with all the data on it, Synology systems of BTRFS and ext4 file systems, as well as Synology Hybrid RAID and traditional RAID configurations like RAID 1 and RAID 5, more on that later, none of those within the Synology architecture support the reintroduction of that drive into the RAID. If you put that drive back in, particularly the longer you wait as well, the system will still need to rebuild the RAID and effectively destroy the data on that drive in order to rebuild the entire RAID configuration. Reintroducing that drive will result into the system needing that degraded RAID rebuild. So bear that in mind and use the locks if you are concerned with that. Now, if you've got other drives, install them now, but personally I'm going to put those two drives in so later in this series I can expand. The next thing we need to do is attach our connections. Now, the last thing you need to be connecting is the power, because in many cases a NAS will automatically boot when power is introduced into it, so we're not going to include that bootable power there. But what we do need to briefly discuss is the network connection here. Now, later on during this video, I'm going to show you that it is possible to set this device up with zero internet connectivity between this and the internet. You will need a connected Windows, Mac, iOS or Android system with internet connectivity briefly, but it's up to you whether you want to set this up with the internet or without the internet. The reason being is this system here requires our connection on the back, and then this cable needs to go in one of two things. Either it needs to be connected into your router, so this would be the device in your home or office where the internet comes in, traditionally via a coaxial going into the rear, and what you can choose is to take your NAS if you wish and plug it directly into your router, and the router that's already got the internet coming in can then connect with the NAS if you choose to download firmware updates, allow remote access with the right security credentials and more. Alternatively, if you are more conscious of your security network or lots of local devices are going to be using wired connection to access the NAS, in those scenarios, you may be using a switch. This is quite a high-end switch, but there's lots of affordable ones you could pick up for as little as £15. With these devices, this allows you to connect in, and then you can bridge a connection between this and the router. The result being you can create barriers, individual subnetworks, often known as VLANs or virtual local area networks, that you can have all of your connected devices here and not necessarily give them direct access to the internet. Whichever one of those systems suits you best, go ahead with that setup. I'm going to be connecting this NAS to a switch, and that switch is going to have internet access, but it allows me to shut down the gates and also introduce other security measures in between there. So now I've connected the local area network here into my NAS. The next thing I'm going to do is the power. Now the next two steps you can do in whatever order you like, but generally what I like to do is to attach the power cable to the NAS first before I attach the mains connector for two reasons. One, because I'd like to know whether it's going to be working. I'd like to make sure the cable is connected before I introduce power. So in my case, I'll go ahead and attach my mains power cable here. You'll often hear a slight click from your PSU when you introduce that power. That's perfectly normal. And then from there, I've now got power introduced into this NAS. I've also included the installation of the drive media and I've attached a local area network. So next up, all I need to do is press this button here. The system will begin to boot. Now, what will happen in the next 30 to 120 seconds or so is the system is going to beep. During the initial boot of the device, I'll just move my mic. During the initial boot of the device, you'll only see this tiny light blinking on its own. Eventually, you will see lights for each of those individual drives, but the system does a brief system check before it boots into the storage media. Then you'll start to hear the drives begin to spin up, and then eventually you'll see LEDs denoting that it knows that the drives are in the system. For the next step, we need to make our way over to my Windows machine. Now, the next steps can be performed on a Windows machine, but they can also be performed on a Mac or a Linux machine. Moreover, you can set up a Synology NAS device with just a mobile phone, and we'll be making a completely separate video on mobile setups just because the majority of users are still going to be using desktop computers such as laptops and desktop PCs to get the job done. But let's move over to the desktop computer and continue with the next step in this setup. So here we are on the desktop of my Windows PC here. Now, depending on how you want to configure your new Synology NAS, there's a few options open to you. The first thing I'd recommend you download, regardless, is to head into the Synology Download Center, and then from there, search for your NAS, as I've done here, finding the DS1522 Plus. I recommend downloading definitely the first tool here to download the desktop package of the tool Synology Assistant. This is a tool that's utilized for not only searching your local area network and finding the Synology NAS in order to set it up for the first time, but also long-term access it, but it also provides other little advantages built into the back end, such as, for example, with a NAS you can choose to map a network drive, something we'll cover in part 2 of this series, as well as connect to it generally, or wake on LAN if you want to turn the device on remotely over the local area network. On top of that, you can utilize a memory test tool that allows you to stress test the memory on your NAS. So if you do choose to upgrade the memory on your Synology NAS, you can use this tool to make sure that it's all working perfectly. Now, if you're running multiple network devices, as good as the Synology Assistant tool is, I do recommend another third-party tool, and that is completely for free, known as Advanced IP Scanner, which will scan your local area network for all of the network devices. And you can see there, not only has it found the Synology NAS devices, but it's also found some others. So if ever you need to bridge gaps between network devices or know the identity of another device on your local area network and extend it even more so, this is a great tool for you. But bear in mind, it's just a little bit more technical. The next thing to bear in mind is whether you want to let the system automatically download the latest software, or if you've made sure that your Synology NAS is disconnected from an internet connection, that you want to manually download it. And if you want to manually download the Synology operating system and upload it to the NAS, while you're still in the download section with Synology's website, head over to the operating system tab, and then from there click download, and that will download that app, the installation package that we will be able to upload later. But for now, we're going to head into the Synology Assistant, and as you can see, the Synology NAS has completed installation. Go ahead and either double click or click connect. As you can see, the next window is inviting us to agree to the terms and conditions from Synology and the user license agreement. Read it through or go ahead and skip it. It's really up to you. And then from there, as you can see, it's now opened a new tab on our web browser here. And this will allow us to begin the installation of the software. Again, we can go ahead if we choose to click install and then either automatically download the latest update if our NAS has got internet access, or we can manually upload the file that we downloaded earlier. And if we downloaded it, we go into where we downloaded it. And as you can see, I've downloaded it here. And this will allow us to automatically upload this version of DSM onto the NAS. But again, you don't have to do that if the NAS has already got internet access that will allow the system to download the latest version automatically for itself. Go ahead and click next after choosing whichever solution suits your needs. From here, it's going to remind you that the drive data on the individual disks is now going to be deleted, as it's going to prepare those drives for usage. Now, if you've already got those drives from another Synology NAS system, then the system will recognize Synology data and Synology datasets on those drives and invite you to migrate. We may do another video on data migration later, but for now we're going to go ahead and proceed with the installation, and it will wipe the content of those drives. You'll have to go ahead and confirm the model ID of your NAS, which it says there, in order to confirm that deletion. So now the system is going to upload that version of the Synology firmware that I've got on my local PC. But again, if you've allowed it to download from the internet, this next process may be a little slower as it downloads DSM. Once it's downloaded DSM or uploaded it from your local machine, the system will install that firmware and then reboot the system. This can take anywhere from between 2 to 5 minutes. And again, based on your internet connection, perhaps even longer than that. What we'll do now is we'll skip ahead to when this page refreshes. You'll know when the system is ready to be re-accessed because either you will hear the system beep in the background upon completing the reboot, or in the Synology Assistant tool, you simply need to click search again and it will search the local area network, and then you will see a change in the system status of what it appears here. It is yet to appear. Let's fast forward to the completion of the restart of this Synology NAS. Once you hear that beep that the system has restarted and the Synology Assistant tool changes from that uninitialized status to ready, you can go ahead with the next steps in this installation. Again, just as a brief side note, it is possible, as you can see here, to set up your Synology NAS using just a mobile phone app. And I even went ahead and did a timed video, as you can see here on screen, that showed just how easy it is to set up that device from scratch using a mobile phone. So I recommend you check that out if you need further guidance on doing this with a mobile. But once again, in the web browser here, after the system has rebooted, this new window will appear, allowing you to continue with the installation. If you already have an existing installation from another Synology NAS backed up onto the cloud or a USB, you can restore your device using the option at the bottom. But otherwise, for new installations, click Start, and for now, give your system a name. In my case, I'm going to call it the 1522 Plus Test NAS. Can't put any more than that. We're just going to put test. From there, we can go ahead and give it the administrator account. Now, this is not the admin, which is disabled by default, but this is going to create a super user on your system to manage it. I'm going to call it admin with a 1. Also, I recommend using a secure password, but for me, I'm going to go ahead and use a mid-range one, but it will warn you if one is less secure than others. Also, you can choose whether you want the Synology NAS to be displayed in the web assistant, which again you may wish or may wish not to do depending on your configuration. You can go back and change this later. From here on the next step, it will invite you, after it's putting these credentials on here, how you want the system to handle your updates. Now again, depending on if you've given your Synology NAS internet access, this will differ greatly, but you can choose to always automatically install important DSM updates, so those are the big ones, or install the latest updates for packages and apps. That means regardless of the importance of the update, it will install them, or you can have to be the notifications to let you know that an update is available, and you can choose to update them. Personally, I always install all of the updates, but I appreciate that some users would rather that didn't happen, because when you do have an update, the system will always need to restart. The system won't restart if individual applications and services have an update, but the whole system update will always reboot the system. And if you have lots of remote connected users, you may want to schedule that for a better time, something you can look into later on in the configuration. From here, click Next, and then you can choose whether to create a Synology account. Now, creating a Synology account, again, is completely free, doesn't cost anything extra, and does allow you to remotely access your Synology NAS, not just on the local area network, but bouncing through Synology's encrypted server if you want to access the NAS remotely. And if you already have an account, you can sign in or you can create one. We will do a dedicated video on remote accessing your Synology NAS, looking at Synology services and third-party ones. And we've already made a video dedicated to the subject of remote accessing your Synology NAS. But nevertheless, having a Synology account has other uses, such as backing up your system configuration to your cloud account and bridging between different devices and Synology's cloud services too. More on that in a follow-up video. But otherwise, you can skip this step and you come back to it later. The same goes if you want Synology to utilize analytical data, so not your actual data, but usage data to improve their platform, and you can choose whether you want them to have access to that. As you can see, we're now applying all of those settings, and very shortly the system will boot into, as you see here, Synology's DSM platform in the web browser. Again, it does recommend individual applications and services to install, but bear in mind that when installing certain apps, you will need to have created your area of storage by default. I'm going to skip this, but you can choose to go ahead with that, but bear in mind you will need to have the storage area ready to go. The same goes if you want to add further warranty to your system, which depending on the system will add your result in adding 2 to 3 years of warranty hardware coverage on your system. Again, you can come back to that, but bear in mind that is only applicable for a short period at the beginning of your Synology NAS ownership to get the extended warranty. And finally, if you want to add in 2FA, two-factor authentication, or OTP services that allow you to use applications on your phone to verify your identity, you can enable those directly from this interface, but I will show you later how to apply them. And finally, you can use adaptive MFA if you want to have that secondary multi-factor authentication to ensure that you've got different ways to verify who you are, but also adding further layers of security between your data and other people. Again, you can unsecure that, but you can come back to it later on. Next up, we want to create our area of storage. This is going to be really important because ultimately, this is the groundwork moving forward on our Synology NAS. Now, before we go ahead and create our area of storage on the system, I do think it's important to understand the difference between a storage pool and a storage volume. A storage pool is the physical storage media being combined into a RAID. It's ultimately the bottom layer of your storage. There's the operating system and the storage pool living on top of it. Volumes are containers of storage. These are where you can plot all of your data, create different volumes if you choose, perhaps one for surveillance, one for backups, one for multimedia, or create one giant volume that can store the lot. But just keep in mind that the RAID, when we talk about that, is the storage pool, the base level of our drives, and the volume is the container or containers of storage on top of it, which can even be broken down further into folders. Go ahead and either click Create Now, or if this window isn't here, go ahead and click the Storage Manager there. Going into the Storage Manager will open up the Storage Creation Wizard. Again, you can go utilize this methodology if you want, but I would recommend just before you do that to verify that your drives are visible and working fine. To do that, on the Storage Manager, go into HDD and SSD and you'll be able to see all of your storage media. So as you can see there are the two Synology hard drives I put inside, the one Synology SSD and the third-party SSD there. So from here on the overview or the storage manager here, click Create Now. This returns us to the creation wizard. Click Start, and from here we select our RAID configuration. As mentioned earlier on, different RAIDs present different advantages, and the number of RAIDs presented to you on this screen will differ depending on the number of drives. If you want later on down the line to mix and match the hard drives you choose, so years down the line adding bigger hard drives, select Synology Hybrid RAID. If you only want 2 disks and you want to mirror that data together with all read and write happening to the 2 disks, ensuring you've always got a perfect up to the millisecond copy, select RAID 1. JBOD leaves the drives independently of themselves, and RAID 0 combines the storage but writes the data across each disk 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And the same goes if you add more drives. The result is if you lose one drive in a RAID 0, there is no recovery whatsoever. I recommend for 2 drives or more always to go for a RAID 1 or an SHR, and also note that a RAID 1 can be graduated down the line when you add more drives to a RAID 5 and a RAID 6 if you choose, but for now I'm going to select SHR. We're going to select the number of drives, so we're going to select the hard drives because as you can see there it has already noticed the Synology SSD, but for now we're just going to use those 2 hard drives. We give it a description, so we're just going to call this one HDD pool, and then from there click Next. The next option is asking us to select the drives. Again, even if you've got 5, 6, 8 drives in here, you don't necessarily need to select all of them. You can if you want to utilize one whole single storage pool, but you can run multiple if you choose. For me, I'm going to use both these drives and put them into that SHR. Next up, you can choose whether you want to do drive health checks before creating the RAID. That would mean that it will check the drives are healthy before you go ahead and start building your foundations of storage on them. I'm going to skip it for this video, but I would recommend you run it. It does take a long time depending on the capacity of the drives, but it is a useful function to do on day one. Next up, as you can see, there is our storage pool allocation, and that we can see that with those two drives, the 4 TB drives in a RAID 1 configuration, because they are mirroring their storage, it means we've got 4 terabytes or 3,715 gigabytes to show. You may be wondering why you're not seeing 4 terabytes or 4,000 gigabytes. That's because of the calculation between megabytes, gigabytes and terabytes. There is technically, and all the way down to kilobytes as well. It's not 1000, it's 1024, and the graduation of those numbers can affect the overall storage number, hence why 4 TB is shown in this fashion. Now, for the storage pool allocation, if you intend to use other features and services and occupy other areas of that storage, then when it comes to creating the volumes, those containers, you may want to save space. So for example, if you wanted to use the full area of storage for one giant volume, just click max. But if you want to create multiple volumes, as mentioned, one for multimedia, one for backups, one for surveillance, and have them separated out, you can go ahead and redefine that number if you choose to smaller amounts of storage. So in my case, for example, I'm going to go ahead and create a single 2 terabyte volume, and that is what we're going to use for a lot of these videos, but it still allows me that other 1715 gigabytes to use in another volume later. It really is up to you, and make sure you name your volume. From there, click next. It will also invite you to select a file system. Now, ext4 is the most well-known of the two there. It's been around for decades. It is a long-term file system. However, a number of Synology's key applications only work with BTRFS file systems. Additionally, BTRFS, or ButterFS as it's known, provides other advantages for file integrity checks. Lower resource consuming snapshot creation and shared folder recreations a lot quicker. Also, BTRFS is slowly becoming the primary file system on Synology NAS systems, and they are phasing out ext4 on certain hardware tiers of their portfolio, and almost certainly this will be phased out across the whole platform eventually. Ultimately, on a Synology NAS of this scale, I would select BTRFS. The only advantages ext4 can bring is performance benefits. Much like SHR, doesn't give you quite the same performance as a RAID 1 or RAID 5 equivalent, it does bring other advantages to bear. Finally, you can choose if you want to encrypt this volume. This is a relatively new feature to Synology NAS systems, and it will allow this area of storage to be locked with a key. What this means is, if someone takes the drives out of this system and tries to put them into another system, this drive volume will be locked. But just keep in mind that the encryption key is stored locally in the system. It can't be accessed because it's in an encrypted locker, but the system is still able to unencrypt or decrypt this storage volume, but if you move it into another system, you can't. You can also create a USB storage key as well. Again, it's really up to you, the value of your data, and later on in our next video when we talk about shared folders, we're going to learn more about other ways to protect your data long term. For those of you wondering about the utilization of M.2 NVMEs, let's talk just briefly about some of the utility and the differences between those drives. As mentioned, we've got a couple of M.2 NVMEs here, a Synology drive and a third-party drive. So for example, if we go into that HDD and SSD tab via the Storage Manager, select Manage Available Drives. And if you choose to here, you can select what you want to do. So for example, if we wanted to create SSD cache, we can go ahead, say which storage area we want to apply the cache to. There's that big volume we created earlier. select next, and we can choose whether we want to use read or write cache that requires 2 SSDs because of the read-write algorithm of read-write cache, or for read-only cache you can use just a single disk. But interestingly, when we click next, as you see here, we can say whether we want to pull them together or RAID 1 to make sure the data can at least be retrieved if a disk dies on that caching, but both drives are visible, the Synology drive and the third-party drive, and we can use those for caching. But as mentioned earlier, if we want to use a storage pool using those M2 NVMEs, select next, select what we want to use. For in this case, we're going to go for an SHR. From there, click next, and as you can see, after this, only one drive is visible, the Synology drive. So just bear that in mind if you're going to be utilizing SSDs in your system or the M2 NVMEs and you want to use them for both caching and storage. You can, if for example, use one SSD like this one and use that as a storage pool for your faster access data, and then use the other SSD in your system that's from a third party for that caching algorithm. Also, caching does have benefits, but it's not going to benefit everyone. To put that into perspective, if we go for, say, read-write cache, and we look at the options of read-write cache, what makes read-write cache really, really useful is with write cache, as data is being sent to the NAS, uploaded from multiple client systems, the data is written to the SSDs before it is written to the hard drives. It's much faster, more responsive, and then in the background, the data is moved over to the hard drives. That does mean, however, that in the event of a power failure, the data is not on the hard drives, it's on the SSDs. That's why write cache requires that RAID 1 functionality. But on top of that, read cache is when the more frequently accessed data over time is copied, not moved, copied over to the SSDs. And that means that when that data is requested yet again, it's being pulled from the faster SSDs, not the slower hard drives. But bear in mind, in Synology's DSM platform, really only small data, INI, metadata, tiny amounts of data, small block, tiny data benefits from this, and larger sequential data like multimedia will not see any benefits. So if you are looking at buying a Synology NAS for multimedia, you're almost certainly going to see no benefit in caching outside of smaller background metadata being scraped and accessible, which once that's done once, that data isn't going to be that frequently accessed, because how often do you watch the same box set or the same movie enough to justify such an expense? And that's really it. You can go ahead and click apply, and now it will create your new storage pool and your new volume. And again, if you want to add more volumes later to your existing storage area, once the storage pool has finished being created, you can go ahead and create a brand new volume if you choose with the available storage. You simply have to wait for the storage pool to finish. Once the storage pool has finished its creation process, you can start creating those other shared areas. Now, later on, we are going to, in our next video, talk about several things. We're going to be talking about shared folders. We're also going to be talking about security protocol and good working practices with creating user accounts on your system for your storage. I'll also be providing other tips and tricks to really make the most of your storage out of the gate, and in later videos going into more specifics about applications and services within the App Center. But that's really enough for the primary setup in this part of this series. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you have, let me help you a little bit more. If you head over to NAS Compares now, on the right hand side of the screen, not only have you got access to our new NAS Builder tool that will help you refine and choose the right NAS solution for your needs, which allows you to select the number of users, the network speed, add-ons and utilities, as well as the number of bays, the amount of storage you need, the amount of failover redundancy, and your budget. It will allow you to find the perfect NAS for your needs and help you get it right first time. Alternatively, you can head over on the right hand side to our free advice section. And in our free advice section, not only do we recommend other alternate sources for free publicly accessible information on public forums, as well as our own Discord and official forums too, but on top of that, you can ask us directly via our completely free service there. It may take 3 to 5 days, and if you're in a rush, use our expedited service here on Ko-Fi. We've also got our community ask forum here. And finally, if you go over to Ko-Fi or Patreon, you can go ahead and join our membership tiers for expedited support every month if you need it, as well as monthly Zooms and seminars. Alternatively, you can hire myself or Eddie the Web Guy for a Zoom consultation. I recommend you check those out. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. As you can see here, our storage pool and volume are now complete and good to go. And I look forward to seeing you on the next part in this series. I'll see you next time.